The December cataclysm arrived not as a skirmish, but as a shattering declaration of war. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was characterized by audacity and tactical brilliance. Few in the American military establishment had believed such a strike was possible. It instantly vaporized American isolationism and the deeply entrenched national complacency. Americans had long believed that the war was only for some poor fools somewhere else. Ensign William Robinson Evans, Jr. captured the immediate, disorienting shock of the attack. He described the violence with the unreality of a fairy tale. Beneath the initial disbelief, however, a grim resolve began to settle in across the nation. Evans, keenly aware of the contemptuous view of Japan held by the American public, feared a fatal mistake had been made. He predicted a conflict far more difficult than the country had ever known. He was tragically correct. In less than 6 months, Japan established a vast, terrifying empire, conquering more than 150 million new subjects. This devastating string of initial victories created a perception of Japanese invincibility that was difficult to shake. This perception fueled a very real fear of invasion on the United States West Coast. The need for trained pilots was immediate, desperate, and overwhelming. This national crisis galvanized men like Tex Gay. Born in 1917, Gay had pursued mechanical engineering at Texas A&M. Driven by a lifelong passion for flight, he first tried to join the Army Air Corps. He failed the physical, however, due to an irregular heartbeat. The setback was momentary. He pivoted instantly to the Navy. He was eventually assigned to the newly formed Torpedo Squadron 8, or VT-8, just a month before Pearl Harbor. The urgency of war meant that pilots were forced to fly whatever equipment was available. Often this equipment was obsolete before the first shot was fired. The primary aircraft for VT-8 was the Douglas TBD Devastator. It was slow, cumbersome, and tragically outmoded against the enemy's 300-mile-per-hour Mitsubishi Zeros. Pilots quickly nicknamed the Devastator a flying coffin. It was capable of little more than 100 miles an hour and armed only with 2.30 caliber pop guns. Tex Gay recorded his deep frustration in his diary. He lamented the apathy of some Americans complaining about a 40-hour work week. Meanwhile, pilots were flying into combat with poor equipment. VT-8 was the spear tip of this technological frustration. Its leader was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron was a force of nature with leathery skin and a bearing like an Oglala Sioux warrior. He ran the squadron like there was no tomorrow. His ambition was intense, fueled by early mockery he had endured after his 1920 appointment to Annapolis. Waldron knew the dangers his 31 pilots faced. He subjected them to rigorous training, including flying dangerously low. He believed this method tested their guts. Waldron's advocacy in Washington was relentless, stemming from his protective nature. He understood that the Devastator was essentially suicide bait. His forceful intervention eventually secured the new Grumman Avenger. This was a nearly fighter-speed plane with steel armor and a potent .50 caliber machine gun turret. Yet, few Avengers would reach the carriers in time for the coming battle. Among the pilots Waldron tested was Fred Mears. Mears arrived at VT-8 seeking reassignment following the sinking of the USS Lexington. A Yale-educated man, his academic focus had once been women, whom he considered his metaphorical major. Mears had found that the thrill of flying had entirely supplanted his previous passions. He was a man constitutionally drawn to risk. Danger was his ultimate high. When Mears reported for duty, Waldron initially dismissed him due to his lack of carrier qualifications. Waldron was a man who valued precision and survival above all else. But Mears was insistent. He had already tried to force the Devastator to perform like a fighter, pushing the slow plane to its absolute limit in training. His eagerness for combat was palpable, a readiness that impressed Waldron despite the technical deficiency. Mears knew the risks, but the draw of the fight was too strong to ignore. He waited for Waldron's final word, ready to prove that personal drive could compensate for technological disparity. The stage was set for a squadron whose fate would be decided not by the quality of its aircraft, but by the sheer, desperate willpower of its men. The pressure aboard the USS Hornet intensified not just from the confirmed proximity of the Japanese fleet. It also stemmed from the stark contrast in command leadership. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had trained his men with a protective ferocity, knowing their obsolete devastators were suicide bait. Conversely, Air Group Commander Stanhope Ring governed with a rigidity that frayed the nerves of the entire air group. Ring was a figure of reserved courtly detachment. His tactical decisions seemed engineered to maximize stress, ignoring hard-won lessons from the Battle of the Coral Sea. That battle had proven the necessity of coordinated fighter protection. Ring insisted on a new tactical plan that ignored this necessity completely. He decided to keep the precious Grumman Wildcat fighters together, designated to stay high. This guaranteed that the slow devastators of Torpedo 8 would be left exposed as sitting ducks. Adding insult to this mortal peril, Ring refused to grant the men liberty when the carrier briefly stopped at Pearl Harbor. This widespread discontent metastasized into outright fury. Among the dive bomber pilots, there was serious dark talk of shooting him down the moment they were airborne. The pilots of VT-8 already grappled with the Navy's failure to equip them all with the modern armored Avenger. Now, their commander's flawed strategy created a new, unnecessary layer of risk. Amidst the rising dread, the pilots desperately searched for anchors to normalcy. The compressed timeline of wartime meant that relationships were forged with terrifying speed. For Ensign Grant Teets, a whirlwind romance with student nurse Diana culminated in an engagement. They had known each other for just 2 weeks. Their love, intensified by separation and the knowledge of impending combat, became a fragile lifeline against the abyss. This pattern of desperate, accelerated commitment was repeated across the squadron. Lieutenant Langdon Feebling was the calm commander of the 6-plane Avenger detachment already at Midway. He confided in a friend about the sudden profound realization of his love for Laura Cassidy. This culminated in a proposal just days before he flew into the heart of the Pacific. These were not the leisurely plans of peacetime men. They were last-gasp commitments, promises whispered into the hurricane. They hoped the bond might somehow survive even if the man did not. As the Hornet steamed toward the intercept point, the psychological toll increased exponentially. The posting of the final flight roster for the Midway mission confirmed the imminent reality of combat for every man aboard. Each name on the typewritten sheet represented a destiny sealed. Pilots were forced to confront their mortality not theoretically, but as a scheduled appointment. One man who had already faced death and been irrevocably changed was Ensign Vic Lewis. Lewis, known for his inherent caution, had undergone a visceral transformation less than a month earlier. During an emergency training landing, a rubber flotation device in his Devastator burst and inflated violently. The plane scraped over the seawall by inches. That agonizing moment of near death had stripped Lewis of his reservations. He stopped being a cautious individual. The experience transformed him into a man willing to take any risk, having already tasted the finality of fate. Now Skipper Waldron estimated the mission had 2.5 to 1 odds against survival. Lewis's accidental psychological conditioning made him uniquely ready. He, like every man in Torpedo 8, knew the Devastator was obsolete. He knew the command structure was fatally flawed. He knew the fighter escort had been denied. All that remained was the final grim duty: to strike the enemy regardless of the cost. The strategic foundation for the coming battle was not laid by the deployment of battleships. It was established by the quiet, tireless efforts of American codebreakers. Their timely deduction of the Japanese plan to strike Midway Atoll gave Admiral Chester Nimitz a crucial 3-day window. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, used this intelligence to set a trap. He knew the odds were overwhelming, his 3 carriers against an armada of 162 Japanese ships, but the intelligence provided a fighting chance. Critical to this gamble was the fate of the USS Yorktown. Severely damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the carrier should have required months of repairs. Instead, hundreds of workers swarmed over her hull in a desperate, miraculous 72-hour effort. This frantic and compressed maintenance was likened to Lilliputians tying down Gulliver. The Yorktown was patched and pushed back to sea, bringing the American carrier count to 3. This fragile lifeline would prove essential to the ambush. The tension aboard the USS Hornet snapped tight late Wednesday, June 3, 1942. The final, electrifying message arrived from Nimitz. The massive Japanese striking force had been sighted. The time for tactical debate was definitively over. It was now a matter of launch sequence and positioning. The final strategic decision that sealed the immediate fate of Torpedo 8 had already been made by Admiral Mitcher. VT-8 would attack without fighter protection. In the low-ceilinged wardroom, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron desperately argued against this tactical suicide. Waldron, the protective father of the squadron, brought his Bible of tactical lessons to the conference table. He presented grim evidence from earlier battles, demanding escort for his slow-crawling devastators. But the command structure was rigid and unforgiving. The 10 Wildcat fighters were designated to stay high, leaving the torpedo planes as exposed bait. Waldron's worst fears were confirmed. His squadron was deemed expendable. As the launch hour approached, the pilots retreated into the small, hot confines of their staterooms. They confronted their destiny by performing the most mundane of human tasks. They tidied their affairs with the quiet finality of men preparing for a long journey. Waldron had already delivered his solemn mimeographed order to his men. It demanded that, if there is only one plane left to make the final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. He then turned to his deepest reflection. He wrote a poignant letter to his wife Adelaide, detailing his acceptance of the inevitable. He found a measure of grim resignation in his own heritage. He noted that should he not return, he had enough Sioux in me to recognize the tactical break when it came. This was a warrior's acknowledgement that the odds were insurmountable, but the duty remained absolute. Across the squadron, other men struggled to encapsulate their lives into single sheets of paper. Ensign Bill Evans, the squire, a philosophical intelligence officer, compiled his writings and poems. His piece, Transition, spoke not just for himself, but for his entire generation. They had been taught that peace was the only touchstone. Now they faced a war where a giant hand wipes clean the slate. Ozzie Gaynor, the pragmatic pilot who had secretly married Rate, finished his final letter. It was a promise whispered across the miles that he would return. Meanwhile, Tex Gay meticulously prepared his Devastator. He checked the unreliable torpedo and the outdated guns. He knew that technological disparity was about to meet naked courage in the vast expanse of the Pacific dawn. They were ready, not because they believed they would survive. They were ready because they had embraced the conviction that their squadron must strike, regardless of the cost. The stage was set for the ultimate sacrifice. The morning of Thursday, June 4th, 1942, dawned clear and terrifyingly bright. The pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8, already committed to a mission they knew was likely suicide, launched their slow, obsolete Devastators. They lifted off from the deck of the USS Hornet. Air Group Commander Stanhope Ring's tactical decision immediately proved catastrophic. The dive bombers and the precious Wildcat fighters flew high, searching for the enemy on a wide, sweeping course. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, however, led his torpedo planes straight toward the known position of the Japanese fleet. Relying on his Sioux intuition and a protective desire to get his men into the fight quickly, Waldron ignored the official flight plan. His determination to strike guaranteed a confrontation entirely without protection. The Devastators, lumbering along at barely 100 miles an hour, found the massive Japanese carrier force first. It was a perfect, devastating sighting. Below them lay the heart of the Japanese Navy. The 4 great carriers, the Akaga, Kaga, Soryu, and Hairu, they were fully loaded, armed and ready to launch their own planes. The Japanese response was swift and annihilating. As the torpedo planes began their low-level approach, the sky filled with the rapid, descending silhouettes of Mitsubishi Zeros. These fast, deadly fighters, armed with 20mm cannons, fell upon the Devastators like birds of prey. The American planes, nicknamed Flying Coffins for their lack of armor and speed, were helpless targets. The pilots of VT-8, including Tex Gay and Vic Lewis, did not flinch. They pressed their attack, flying directly into a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire and cannon shells. Their goal was simple: to fly low enough to release their unreliable torpedoes. Crucially, they needed to draw the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. It was a desperate, sacrificial charge. It fulfilled Waldron's final grim instruction: if there is only one plane left to make the final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. Not a single torpedo found its mark. The Japanese defense was too fierce, the planes too slow, and the torpedoes too unreliable. But the sacrifice was not in vain. The Zeros were now focused entirely on the surface, distracted by the low-flying, doomed Devastators. The skies above were suddenly clear. High above the melee, the American dive bombers arrived at the critical, decisive moment. These included planes from the patched-up USS Yorktown. Finding the Japanese carriers completely exposed and undefended, the dive bombers plunged down. Their bombs struck the fully fueled and armed decks below. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers were ablaze, transformed into raging infernos by secondary explosions. Torpedo Squadron 8 was effectively wiped out. Of the 15 planes launched from the Hornet, only Ensign George Gay was plucked from the water hours later. He had miraculously survived the crash and a subsequent machine gun strafing. The squadron's sacrifice, a willingness to trade their lives for position, had bought the crucial minute of vulnerability. This minute was needed to deliver the decisive blow. The Battle of Midway proved to be the absolute turning point in the Pacific War. In a single morning, the Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of their naval air power, and over 3,000 men. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered forever. Admiral Nimitz's gamble, predicated on intelligence and sealed by individual sacrifice, paid off spectacularly. Japanese expansion eastward was abruptly and permanently halted. The strategic initiative, held since Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Navy, was instantly and irrevocably shifted to the Allies. But victory at Midway did not mean peace. The strategic initiative immediately translated into the bloodiest, most attritional campaign of the early war, Guadalcanal. Beginning in August 1942, the focus shifted from the dazzling blue of the ocean to the suffocating, humid hell of the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal was the strategic equivalent of Midway. It was a desperate, 6-month struggle to determine the fate of Japan's vast Pacific Empire. Unlike the quick, sharp strike of the carrier battle, this was a war of grinding attrition. It was fought in ankle-deep mud, infested with disease, and defined by horrific close-quarters combat. The legacy of the men of Torpedo 8 is therefore not written in the glory of the strike. It is written in the profound, lasting impact of their personal sacrifice. Their story, and the stories of those who went on to fight the long, brutal campaign that followed, is not written to mythologize war. It is written to realistically portray the human experience. It captures the fear, the duty, the love, and the final, absolute commitment that defined a generation. These individual acts of courage, often obscured by the grand narratives of military victory, are the only living link we have to this critical period of history. The war was far from over, but the direction of the tide was set, paid for in the lifeblood of men who flew obsolete planes into impossible odds.